April 1945. The war in Europe was breathing its final ragged breaths. Across the plains of central Germany, the once mighty Reich had collapsed into ruin. Its armies scattered, its cities reduced to ash, its people trapped in the grey silence that follows fire. Near the small town of Limburg, a convoy of American trucks rolled through the spring mud. Inside, huddled under wool blankets, sat dozens of women in faded Wehrmacht field uniforms. They were prisoners of war, but their faces carried neither defiance nor despair. To the shock of their captors, they looked relieved. For years, these women had served in the background of Hitler's war machine, clerks, radio operators, medics and auxiliaries attached to Luftwaffe and army divisions. By April, they were all that remained of their shattered units. The men who once commanded them were dead, captured or had vanished into the forests, hunted by advancing Allied patrols. Now, as the trucks bounced toward a temporary camp, the women whispered among themselves, not about escape or revenge, but about food, safety, and the strange calm that had replaced the thunder of artillery. To the Americans, this was an anomaly. Female POWs were rare, female German POWs even more so. Most of the captured women were terrified of being found by the Soviets, whose approach from the east carried rumors of revenge too brutal to describe. They had surrendered westward intentionally, waving improvised white cloths at American lines. Many had heard stories of how Americans treated their captives, with rations, blankets, even respect. In the chaos of a collapsing Reich, that sounded like salvation. The convoy stopped near a fenced compound, an improvised holding site built from a commandeered farm. The spring air carried the smell of damp hay and diesel. Guards shouted directions, but there was no cruelty in their tone. One soldier opened the truck door and helped the women step down. They were thin, pale, shivering from exhaustion. One clutched a small notebook filled with names. Friends, nurses, fellow auxiliaries, lost along the retreat from Kassel. Another carried a blood-stained Red Cross armband as if it were a passport. Inside the camp, the scene was almost surreal. Rows of tents, clean water barrels, even a field kitchen steaming with beans and bread. For soldiers who had grown used to deprivation, it felt unreal. When a young American sergeant offered coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz barley brew they had known, one of the women began to cry. Another, a 20-year-old Luftwaffe signals operator, whispered that she hadn't tasted warmth since Christmas. The guards exchanged puzzled glances. These were enemies, but they looked like the ghostly reflection of their own sisters back home. Behind the barbed wire, a quiet transformation began. The women shed their field coats, folded them neatly and sat together in the sun. They mended each other's sleeves with scavenged thread. They helped scrub the camp's laundry buckets. American medics examined frostbitten fingers and ulcered feet, marking each patient on a clipboard with calm professionalism. For women who had been trained to serve a cause built on cruelty, such decency felt disorienting. A captured interpreter recalled hearing one of them whisper, "If this is defeat, what was victory?" In the nearby command tent, U.S. officers debated what to do with the unexpected captives. Official policy had not envisioned large numbers of female Wehrmacht auxiliaries. They were not civilians, yet they weren't frontline combatants either. The Geneva Convention recognized them as lawful POWs, but few facilities were prepared to house them separately. The decision came swiftly. They would be kept under protection until repatriation could be arranged. Protection, the officers emphasized, a word that carried more comfort than any of the women expected to hear from an enemy uniform. Meanwhile, back across the crumbling front lines, Germany itself was collapsing into chaos. Refugee columns stretched for miles, clogging roads with carts and bicycles. Airfields lay abandoned, planes half buried in mud. The radio crackled with fragments of hopeless messages. "Hold the line! Retreat east! All units stand fast!" But the lines no longer existed. For many of the female auxiliaries, surrendering westward had been an act not of treason, but of survival. In their diaries, recovered later by Allied intelligence, some wrote that they believed captivity in the West might at least offer a chance to live beyond the war. Night fell over the Limburg camp with a strange peace. The guards allowed small fires for warmth. A few women hummed quiet songs, folk melodies from Saxony and Bavaria, that drifted through the darkness like fading memories of home. Across the fence, an American corporal on watch listened, half mesmerized. In his notebook, he wrote that the tune reminded him of his mother's lullabies in Kansas. Two enemies, bound by fatigue, found a shared humanity in the same melody. Days passed. The prisoners were assigned light duties: kitchen work, nursing fellow detainees, translating documents. Food remained scarce, but the rations were equal. They were given soap and fresh water, luxuries they had not known for months. Some asked if they could send letters home, but mail routes were shattered. Others refused, fearing that returning home might mean Soviet occupation or the shame of being labeled collaborators. News filtered in that Berlin was surrounded, Hitler still alive but cornered. Each rumor carried a new wave of unease. Among the prisoners, leadership emerged. A 31-year-old former nurse named Hilde managed to organize daily routines: cleaning, first aid, even improvised English lessons with a dictionary borrowed from an American medic. Her calm authority impressed both sides. She reminded her companions to maintain dignity. They treat us as humans. We must act as such. For the women, Captivity was beginning to feel like an island of order in a world collapsing outside the wire. American officers noted the discipline with quiet admiration. Reports described the female POWs as cooperative, orderly, and surprisingly composed. The contrast with the gaunt, hollow-eyed male prisoners arriving from the Ruhr pocket was striking. The women smiled, even laughed. One military chaplain later wrote that he had never witnessed such gratitude for simple human decency. When he held a brief Sunday service, half the camp attended, some kneeling, some standing silently, tears cutting through the dust on their faces. And yet, beneath the fragile calm, fear still lingered. The women knew that when the war officially ended, they would be repatriated. Many dreaded that moment. Home was no longer a place of safety. It was ruins, hunger, and vengeance. Letters from liberated towns described atrocities committed during the retreat. Some of the POWs whispered that they would rather remain behind barbed wire in America's custody than return to a home they no longer recognized. One evening, as the sun set red over the Rhine Valley, Hilda watched the American flag flutter above the camp gate. She turned to the others and said softly, "Perhaps captivity is not punishment. Perhaps it is mercy." The word spread through the camp like a confession none had dared speak. They were prisoners, but for the first time in years they were not afraid. By the end of April, American trucks began moving captured personnel toward larger collection centers. As the women packed their few belongings, uncertainty shadowed every face. Rumors whispered that they might be shipped to France or England or even the United States. Others said they would soon be released to a devastated homeland. But for many, the thought of going back felt more terrifying than remaining here. Outside the wire, thunder rolled across the horizon, distant artillery, the dying echo of a war nearly over. Inside, the women waited, caught between defeat and deliverance, between the past they had served and the uncertain mercy that awaited them. And as the first trucks arrived to take them away, none could guess that some among them would soon make a choice few could understand, a choice that defied the very idea of home. The trucks rolled west, engines rumbling under a sky stained with smoke and spring rain. For the German women packed inside, each mile was a step deeper into uncertainty. And yet for many that uncertainty was still preferable to the horrors waiting back east. When they reached the Allied transit depot at Andernach, they saw the scale of Germany's collapse. Tens of thousands of prisoners filled fields and open enclosures, an ocean of grey uniforms and hollow eyes. Yet even here the female POWs were treated differently, separated, guarded, and to their astonishment respected. The Americans, though battle-worn, understood the optics. Orders from the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force were explicit. All captured personnel, regardless of gender, were to be handled according to the Geneva Convention. Field kitchens were ordered to supply equal rations, medical staff to conduct proper triage. The men of the 106th Evacuation Hospital set up a tent specifically for the women, with cots, blankets, and wash basins. One lieutenant, a former engineering student from Michigan, took the initiative to rig a makeshift shower system using salvaged pipes and a water pump from a wrecked truck. For the women, stepping under real running water felt like stepping out of the war itself. Technically, most of them belonged to the Wehrmacht's Helfer Innenkorps, the Army's female auxiliary corps, created to free men for the front lines. They operated radios, coded messages, maintained field hospitals, and handled logistics. Their work had bound them to the war machine, but not to its ideology. Many had seen atrocities pass through their signal lines. Reports marked Strengerheim top secret, describing villages wiped out or prisoners executed. Some later told American interrogators that surrender felt like a form of repentance, an escape from orders that had long since lost their meaning. What the Americans didn't fully grasp at first was the complexity of the German surrender system. The collapse of the Reich left millions in a bureaucratic limbo, soldiers, auxiliaries, and forced laborers all mixed together. It fell to Allied officers, engineers, and interpreters to build an entire infrastructure for processing human beings. Temporary camps were drawn up like blueprints, fencing layouts, water points, latrines, sleeping areas. Engineers from the U.S. Army Corps worked alongside captured German technicians to keep pumps running and field generators operational. The result was something between a humanitarian operation and a logistical miracle. For the female prisoners, daily life became a routine of unexpected normalcy. They worked in the kitchens or laundries, assisted nurses, and translated captured documents. Each morning they lined up for roll call beneath the watch of MPs, the sound of boots on gravel echoing through the valley. The Americans noted their efficiency. By instinct or training, the women maintained discipline without coercion. There was order where chaos should have been. In the evenings, guards relaxed enough to talk. Many were young, farm boys from Iowa or mechanics from Ohio, who had never seen the inside of a European home. They asked simple questions: what life had been like before the war, whether ration cards existed, what people ate when bread ran out. The women answered cautiously at first, but soon conversation replaced suspicion. One American recalled a former Luftwaffe teleprinter operator, describing how she had once handled messages signed by Goering himself. She said it with neither pride nor shame, only exhaustion. "We obeyed the machine," she told him. It was easier than thinking. Technological marvels fascinated both sides. The Americans showed off their portable radios, compact sets built by Motorola and Zenith, each small enough to fit into a backpack yet powerful enough to reach command posts miles away. The German women recognized them instantly as the kind of communication gear their own army had always lacked in abundance. A few of the former signal operators examined the American equipment with quiet awe. "If we'd had this," one said, "perhaps the war would have lasted even longer." The irony hung in the air like smoke. The Americans also demonstrated their field rations: canned meat, powdered eggs, chocolate. The women were astonished. Germany's supply system, once a marvel of precision, had collapsed under bombing and blockade months before. Their own rations had been little more than thin soup and stale bread. Here they saw a different kind of warfare, one powered by logistics, by machines and factories that never slept. As an American engineer explained how trucks were produced in Detroit by the thousands each week, one of the prisoners whispered that such numbers sounded like fantasy. But it was that industrial might, gears, rivets, conveyors, that had crushed the Reich far more efficiently than bombs alone. When news arrived that Hitler was dead, the camp went silent. There were no cheers, no tears, only an emptiness that settled over the tents like fog. For many of the women, the dictator had been a distant abstraction. His voice, a sound from radios that had long since fallen silent. Now the myth was gone and only survival remained. Some spoke of home, if home still existed. Others confessed to nightmares of Russian troops, of rumors whispered by refugees, looting, reprisals, unspeakable violence. In the West, they had found safety not in victory but in surrender. As weeks turned to months, something remarkable began to happen. A number of the female POWs formally requested to remain in Allied custody. They asked to delay repatriation, claiming they had no safe destination. Their homes were now in Soviet zones. Letters that trickled in from relatives described arrests, hunger, and occupation. To the astonishment of American officers, some women openly declared they would prefer indefinite captivity to being liberated by the East. One lieutenant recorded the moment a young auxiliary stepped forward, saluted, and said through an interpreter, "Sir, I am a prisoner of the United States. Please do not release me." The paperwork was unprecedented. Under international law, POWs were to be repatriated as soon as feasible. But how could one repatriate someone to ruin? The US authorities classified these women as voluntary retained personnel, a bureaucratic phrase masking an emotional truth. They had chosen their captors over their homeland. Each application was carefully reviewed. Psychiatrists and intelligence officers interviewed the women for motives, ensuring no coercion or espionage risk. Most cases were approved. Life within the camp evolved further. Some prisoners began teaching English in makeshift classrooms. Others tended gardens planted between the barbed wire fences. American engineers provided scrap lumber to build benches, and an improvised chapel appeared, a place of reflection for both guards and captives. The strange equilibrium deepened. Enemies turned neighbors, discipline tempered by empathy. For a few of the American officers, the situation provoked introspection. They had entered Germany expecting fanatic resistance, and found instead a weary generation of young women who had served without belief. They were victims of a system that devoured its own children, one captain wrote in his diary. And now in our custody they are finally at peace. But even peace had its own tension. Rumors spread that the camp would soon be dismantled, the prisoners transferred to French or British control. The women reacted with panic. Many pleaded to stay under the American flag, fearing harsher treatment elsewhere. A few even proposed working for the US Army as translators or clerks. The war might be ending, but for them, the battle to remain in captivity had only begun. One evening, as a thunderstorm swept over the camp, lightning illuminated the muddy ground, where the women stood watching the flagpole bend in the wind. The rain blurred the border between prisoner and guard, both soaked, both silent, both staring at the symbol of a nation that, for these women, now meant something unthinkable: safety. The decision facing them would soon divide the group forever. Repatriation orders were being drafted. Trains were ready, but a small number of German women would soon make a choice that stunned their captors, an act of defiance not against the enemy, but against the idea of going home. By the summer of 1945, the war was officially over, but for the German women POWs held in American custody, the hardest question still loomed: where did they belong now? The guns had fallen silent, the Reich had disintegrated, and yet the fear of what waited beyond the camp's barbed wire was greater than anything the front lines had ever offered. The Allied trucks that once symbolized deliverance now stood ready to take them home. But home no longer meant safety. In the offices of the US Army's Prisoner of War Administration, clerks typed up repatriation rosters. Each name carried a decision: east or west. Those from regions now under Soviet occupation begged to stay. Others, from the bombed-out remains of Cologne or Dresden, confessed they had no families left. When American officers asked why they refused repatriation, the answers were hauntingly similar: I have nowhere to go. The war took everything. Here, at least, I am treated as a person. The phenomenon puzzled Allied command. Captivity was supposed to end when peace arrived. Instead, a number of women requested continued imprisonment. Psychologists dispatched from London and Washington interviewed them to understand this strange loyalty. The results painted a picture of deep trauma mixed with pragmatic survival. Years of propaganda had promised these women a glorious Reich, only for them to watch it crumble into famine and death. In contrast, their American captors had offered order, food, and dignity. The reversal was almost spiritual. Letters from relatives in the Soviet zone only strengthened their resolve. Some told of arrests by the NKVD, others of forced labor camps or public shaming for serving Hitler's army. To the women, these reports confirmed what they already suspected: to return home meant to vanish. If we go east, one of them told a Red Cross officer, we will never come back. That single statement, part plea, part prophecy, found its way into internal Allied memos about the growing refugee crisis that would soon define post-war Europe. In the Andernach camp, and later in relocation centers across the Rhineland, daily life continued with quiet rhythm. The women rose early, cleaned their quarters, and reported to assigned duties. They assisted in translation bureaus, sorted captured documents, or helped American engineers inventory the abandoned equipment of the Wehrmacht. One group worked with the Signal Corps, cataloging damaged radios and teletypes, machines they had once operated in service of the Reich. Now they handled them for their former enemies, carefully labeling each part with neat handwriting. The irony was not lost on anyone. The Americans, for their part, struggled between compassion and protocol. Officially, the Geneva Convention did not permit indefinite voluntary captivity, but neither could they force anyone to return to Soviet territory against their will. The solution was bureaucratic improvisation. The women were reclassified as civilian internees under protective custody. It was a technical fiction, but it granted them the right to remain under U.S. authority until safe resettlement could be arranged. As word spread, the camps took on a strange new identity. They were no longer prisons of war, but sanctuaries for those displaced by ideology and geography. Within the fences, a fragile sense of community blossomed. The women organized choirs, held Sunday prayers, even staged small plays about peace and forgiveness. American guards sometimes joined the audience, clapping politely at the end. A Red Cross nurse who visited wrote in her diary, "It is a prison where hope has learned to live again." Engineers from the U.S. Army continued improving conditions, installing electric lights, repairing wells, expanding infirmaries. These quiet acts of maintenance kept the fragile ecosystem alive. One of the engineers, Sergeant Harold Baines, wrote home to his wife that the girls fix radios faster than half our men. They just need tools and coffee. Behind the humor lay admiration. The German women, once part of a system built on obedience, were now demonstrating initiative and resilience in rebuilding what little could be rebuilt. Not all interactions were easy. Some guards still viewed them with suspicion, haunted by memories of comrades lost to the Blitz or the Ardennes. Yet over time, even hardened veterans softened. Shared labor and mutual respect eroded the boundaries of hatred. One American sergeant later admitted that he began to see the women not as enemies, but as people caught in history's wrong current. Meanwhile, the geopolitical tides were shifting. Germany was being divided. The Iron Curtain, though not yet named, was descending across Europe. American intelligence realized that many of these women, trained in communication and logistics, could prove useful in the emerging Cold War. Some were discreetly offered employment with occupation forces as typists, translators, or administrative aides. Those who accepted were vetted, documented, and released into service under civilian contracts. For them, captivity had evolved into citizenship of a new world order, one that spoke English, paid in dollars, and valued stability over ideology. Others chose a quieter path. When the camps finally began closing in late 1946, small groups were transferred to displaced persons facilities operated by the International Refugee Organization. There they waited months, sometimes years, for visas to Canada, to Britain, even to the United States. Many were eventually absorbed into post-war reconstruction programs as nurses, clerks, or domestic workers. For them, captivity had been a bridge between two lives, one destroyed by war, the other cautiously rebuilt through mercy. A few remained behind the wire until the very end. When American command finally issued closure orders for the last facility in 1947, a handful of women still refused to leave. Their argument was simple. The world out there is broken. Inside here, we remember how to live. The statement, recorded by an army chaplain, captured the paradox of their experience. They had entered the camps as prisoners of defeat, but emerged as witnesses to a different kind of victory, the victory of compassion over vengeance. Post-war, studies would later cite their story as one of the earliest examples of psychological anchoring among displaced persons, a phenomenon where safety, even within confinement, becomes preferable to freedom without structure. Yet beyond psychology, there was something profoundly human in their decision. For those who had seen their homeland burn and their ideals collapse, captivity under a merciful enemy was not humiliation. It was redemption. Years later, as West Germany rebuilt and the Cold War hardened, a few of these former POWs wrote memoirs under changed names. They described the taste of American coffee, the first shower after months of dirt, the kindness of medics who treated wounds without judgment. One wrote, "In defeat, we learned what humanity meant. The camp was our school. By then, the fences were gone, the fields green again. Nothing remained but the ghosts of voices carried on the wind. But for those who had lived through it, the lesson endured. Freedom, they discovered, is not simply the absence of chains, it is the presence of dignity. When historians later asked why some German women had chosen captivity over home, the answer defied politics. They had seen both tyranny and mercy, and chosen the side that made them feel human again. In the ruins of a fallen empire, surrounded by enemies who refused to become monsters, they found something no regime had ever given them: peace. And so, as the final American convoys withdrew from Germany, a quiet truth lingered in the silence they left behind. Sometimes, the greatest liberation begins within the walls of captivity.